Imagine this. Your boss walks into your office, closes the door and says, "I need a favor. I need you to pretend to be my wife at Christmas." You laugh, because of course it must be a joke. But then he adds one condition, and suddenly the room feels colder than winter itself. It began as an ordinary December morning, the kind filled with the low hum of office chatter, the distant jingle of holiday decorations being hung in the lobby, and the comforting aroma of cinnamons, scented candles someone had illegally lit in accounting. She was typing away at her desk, sorting through yet another stack of pre-holiday paperwork, when she noticed her boss hovering by the doorway of her cubicle. He wasn't the type to wander the office. He moved with purpose, always knowing exactly where he needed to be, and usually that place was behind the closed door of his corner office. But today, he stood there hesitating, clearing his throat quietly, as if preparing himself for something significant. When he finally met her eyes, his expression was nothing short of unusual. Nervous, tense, and strangely hopeful. That alone was enough to make her stop typing and prepare herself for a conversation she sensed would be anything but routine. He asked if she had a moment, but the tone of his voice suggested he wasn't asking at all. He was pleading. She followed him into his office, half expecting a difficult work assignment or a confidential announcement. Maybe he wanted her to lead a last-minute project, or maybe an important client had made an unexpected demand. But the moment he closed the door behind them, the energy in the room shifted. This wasn't professional, at least not in the way she understood professionalism. He fiddled with his watch, straightened a folder on his desk, and sat down only to stand up again seconds later. She had never seen him flustered. He was the kind of man who maintained his confidence even when the building's server crashed or the CEO made a surprise visit. Yet here he was, struggling to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled slightly, just enough for her to know that whatever he was about to ask was deeply personal and emotionally loaded. Then he said the words she replayed for days afterward. "I need you to pretend to be my wife at Christmas." For a moment, she honestly thought she'd misheard him. She blinked, stared at him, then let out a small, uncertain laugh because the request sounded absurd, like the plot of a poorly written holiday sitcom. Surely he didn't mean it literally, but he didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was both earnest and desperate, as if this ridiculous question had been weighing on him for far too long. She tried to imagine all the logical explanations for such a strange plea. Maybe he needed to win some kind of charity competition. Maybe his family had a tradition of bringing guests, or maybe he had lost a bet. But his face told her nothing except that this was serious, and every possible explanation she came up with seemed increasingly unlikely. As he continued to talk, the unusual request became even more complex. He explained that Christmas at his family home wasn't like the casual, cheerful gatherings most people enjoyed. His family was traditional, judgmental, and obsessed with appearances. For years, they had pressured him about settling down, constantly interrogating him about his personal life, his romantic choices, and the absence of a wife they believed he should have had by now. He had told them he was in a committed relationship just to buy himself some peace, but now the lie had grown too large to manage. His mother expected him and his supposed wife to attend Christmas dinner. The mere thought of disappointing her, he said, had turned the entire holiday into a looming disaster. And so, cornered by his own fabrication, he believed the solution lay in asking the one person he trusted, the one person who knew how to handle pressure with grace, her. Still, trust or not, his request made her uncomfortable in ways she didn't yet have the words to express. She thought about the blurred lines that often appeared between kindness and obligation, about how easily someone in his position of authority could create a situation that felt like a trap. Her boss wasn't abusive or inappropriate, at least not intentionally, but that didn't change the fact that he held power over her career, her workload, and her future at the company. The very nature of his question made her heart pound with an uneasy mixture of sympathy and alarm. She wanted to understand his situation, to help him, even to comfort him. But she also felt the weight of something unspoken, something that told her this favor would cost her far more than a simple evening of acting. This wasn't just an unusual request. It was a request that had consequences, whether spoken or hidden. As she processed his words, standing there in the middle of his office with the glow of winter sunlight bouncing off the polished floors, she realized that her life had just taken an unexpected turn. Nothing about this conversation fit the world she thought she understood, where boundaries were clear, requests were reasonable, and bosses did not ask employees to step into the role of a spouse for a holiday dinner. It was a moment that revealed how quickly the familiar could shift into the surreal, how a single question could unravel the balance of comfort and stability she had carefully built. And though he waited for her answer with desperate eyes, she could already feel the tension rising inside her, warning her that whatever she decided next would alter things in ways she hadn't yet begun to imagine. What unsettled her the most wasn't the bizarre request itself. It was the moment he added one more thing. After explaining the tangled lie he had told his family, and after painting Christmas as an emotional minefield he could no longer navigate alone, he paused. His voice grew quieter, almost fragile, and he looked at her with the kind of intensity that made her hold her breath. She thought the strange part of this conversation had already passed, that nothing he said could possibly surprise her more than being asked to play his wife for the holidays. But then, with a deep, shaky inhale, he revealed the condition that turned a weird request into something far more complicated. No one could ever know about this arrangement, not her friends, not her family, not anyone at work. It had to remain an absolute secret. The words sank into the room like frost, and she felt the temperature shift even though the heater hummed steadily in the background. A secret, not just discretion, secrecy. He insisted that for this to work, no one could find out. Not a whisper, not a slip, not even a hint. He explained that if anyone knew what they were doing, the entire facade would fall apart. His family would see the truth. Her colleagues would misunderstand her relationship with her boss, and he would be humiliated in ways he claimed he could never recover from. But the way he said it, the urgency in his tone, the finality in the request, felt like it wasn't just about protecting himself. It felt like he was pulling her into something restrictive, something that demanded not just cooperation, but total silence. And silence, she knew, could be heavy. It could be binding. It could be dangerous. As he spoke, she couldn't ignore the knot forming in her stomach. A secret of that scale wasn't harmless. It wasn't simple. It required a level of trust and emotional entanglement she had never agreed to. Keeping it from her friends meant she'd have no one to confide in if things became overwhelming. Keeping it from her family meant carrying the weight alone. But keeping it from HR and the workplace, that changed everything. It was one thing to help someone through a personal problem, but another entirely to hide something that directly involved her professional environment. And he wasn't just asking for silence. He was asking her to isolate herself inside a lie that wasn't even hers to begin with. She could already feel how it would grow, twisting into every conversation, every decision, every moment leading up to Christmas. He tried to make the request sound reasonable, even noble, insisting that this secrecy was only temporary and only necessary to avoid complications. He repeated that he trusted her more than anyone else, that she was the only person capable of handling this with maturity and discretion. But trust, she realized, could sometimes be used as a shield for manipulation. She didn't know if he meant to pressure her, but the words he chose walked the thin line between flattery and coercion. Every compliment he offered felt like an anchor pulling her deeper into an agreement she wasn't ready to make. And all the while, a part of her wondered, if this plan was truly harmless, why did it need to be hidden? Why did the truth have to stay locked away like something shameful? The condition also made her question his motives more than she had before. What exactly was he trying to protect? His pride, his family's approval, his professional reputation, or something else entirely? Something he wasn't saying aloud. She didn't want to assume the worst, but she also knew enough about human behavior to recognize when someone was desperate to control a narrative. His insistence on secrecy meant she couldn't seek advice, couldn't establish boundaries with someone else's help, couldn't even explain her sudden disappearance on Christmas. The moment she said yes, if she ever did, she would be stepping into a world where every step had to be calculated, every word measured, every action perfectly aligned with a story she never agreed to write. She stood there listening, torn between empathy and unease. She saw the strain in his face, the exhaustion in his posture, the years of pressure he'd carried from a family that never seemed satisfied. A part of her felt sorry for him, truly. But sympathy didn't erase the reality of what he was asking. This wasn't just a strange holiday favor. It was a commitment to secrecy, an emotional contract with invisible clauses she couldn't even begin to outline. And as he waited for her reaction, she felt the weight of his condition settling onto her shoulders like a heavy winter cloak. One she wasn't sure she wanted to wear, even for a moment. The moment she stepped out of his office after hearing his shocking request and the condition attached to it, she felt something inside her shift, a quiet alarm, a whisper reminding her that she needed to protect herself. It wasn't that she disliked her boss or believed he intended harm. It was the sheer unfamiliar territory he had dragged her into, the emotional weight of the secrecy, and the undeniable imbalance of power between them. As she walked back toward her desk, each step felt heavier than the last. She realized that this situation wasn't just unusual. It was a test of her boundaries, of her ability to recognize when a line was being crossed, even if that line was wrapped in sympathy, trust, or desperation. People often imagine boundary violations as loud, obvious events, but sometimes they appear gently, disguised as favors, wrapped in emotional pleas that make it difficult to say no. She knew deep down that boundaries weren't simply invisible walls people put up. They were essential guardrails that kept relationships, professional and personal, healthy. In the workplace especially, they were what allowed individuals to function with dignity, clarity, and security. And yet here she was, faced with a request that didn't just blur the line between professional and personal. It erased it entirely. Her boss hadn't asked for extra hours on a project or help with a difficult client. He had asked her to step into his private life, to represent herself as someone she was not, and to actively participate in a lie that reached beyond the office and into the most intimate spaces of his world. It was the kind of request that could entangle her in ways she had never anticipated, intertwining her identity with his in a way that felt overwhelming. She sat at her desk, trying to appear composed while inside she unraveled. She replayed his words, his expression, the nervous way he had paced before asking her to keep everything a secret. A part of her wanted to be understanding, to acknowledge the pressure he felt from his family, and to see him not as a powerful boss, but as a person struggling beneath years of expectation. But the larger, wiser part of her knew that empathy did not require self-sacrifice. She could care about his feelings without surrendering her own sense of self. She could understand his predicament without stepping into a narrative that wasn't hers to solve. And most importantly, she could acknowledge the complexity of his situation without allowing it to override clear professional boundaries. Recognizing this was uncomfortable but necessary. As the afternoon went on, she found herself questioning everything: her role, her limits, even her understanding of what was appropriate. She tried to imagine what would happen if she said yes. Would she be able to look her colleagues in the eye knowing she was hiding something so personal? What if someone noticed something strange? What if rumors started? What if the performance didn't end with Christmas and he asked her to extend it? Boundaries, she knew, didn't just protect her. They helped prevent situations from spiraling into chaos. Without them, small favors could become patterns. Patterns could become expectations. and expectations could become obligations that were nearly impossible to escape. Once a boundary was crossed, it was rarely easy to rebuild it. She also wondered how her boss saw the situation. Had he convinced himself that this request was harmless? Had he forgotten the influence he carried as her employer? Or had he simply assumed she would say yes because she had always been dependable, always willing to help, always there to support the team? That thought unsettled her more than she expected. She didn't want her kindness to be seen as weakness. She didn't want her cooperation to be mistaken for permission to blur lines. She had worked too hard to build a professional reputation, grounded in competence and respect. And now, for the first time, she realized that saying yes might not be seen as generosity. It could be interpreted as acquiescence, as acceptance of a dynamic that could easily expand beyond what she could control. The truth was simple yet difficult. Boundaries mattered because without them, people lost themselves. They became characters in someone else's story, carrying emotional burdens they never agreed to bear. As she stared at her computer screen, pretending to focus on the documents in front of her, she felt the quiet strength of that realization settle into her bones. She did not want to lose herself, not to a holiday lie, not to someone else's family expectations, and certainly not to a favor that required her to shrink her voice and silence her instincts. And though she hadn't decided what she would say to him yet, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next had to honor her boundaries, not erase them. She had always taken pride in being someone others could rely on. Her kindness wasn't performative. It wasn't something she did for praise or recognition. It was simply who she was, steady, compassionate, willing to help when someone needed support. But as she sat at her desk, replaying her boss's request over and over again, she began to realize that kindness could be a double-edged sword. People who were dependable often found themselves carrying weights that weren't meant for them. People who were understanding often became the ones others leaned on the hardest. And in this moment, she felt the subtle but powerful shift between wanting to be helpful and feeling obligated to solve a problem that wasn't hers. It wasn't that she didn't care about her boss's predicament. She could see how tangled his life had become, how deeply the expectations of his family had worn him down. She had seen the exhaustion behind his well-pressed suits and the loneliness hidden beneath his stern professionalism. She knew that his request came from a place of desperation rather than manipulation. At least, not intentional manipulation. But even then, she couldn't ignore the unspoken truth. Desperation could still create pressure, and pressure could still blur the line between a voluntary act of kindness and an emotional obligation. As she thought about the secret he wanted her to carry and the role he wanted her to play, she felt the pull of obligation wrapping around her like vines slowly tightening. She had been in situations before where people mistook her willingness to help as an unlimited resource. Friends who assumed she would always be available, colleagues who came to her to fix their mistakes, even family members who believed her patience had no limits. At the time, she had told herself it was fine. Helping others made her feel needed, valuable, strong. But now, confronted with a request that was far beyond anything she had ever been asked to do, she realized how dangerous that pattern could be, because kindness, no matter how genuine, could become suffocating when it was taken for granted. And obligation, especially one rooted in someone else's emotional turmoil, could drain her spirit in ways she wasn't prepared to face. Her boss had framed the request as a compliment. "You're the only one I can trust," he had said. "You're the only person who could make this believable." Those words, spoken so gently yet so urgently, lingered in her mind. Part of her felt flattered, maybe even appreciated, but another part recognized the weight hidden behind them. When someone says you're the only one who can help, it creates an emotional trap. Declining suddenly feels like betrayal, like letting someone down, like choosing selfishness over compassion. She hated that feeling. She hated knowing that her own empathy was being used, even unintentionally, to corner her emotionally. And yet, she couldn't place the blame solely on him. He was panicked, vulnerable, and grasping for a solution. The real conflict was within herself, the struggle between her instinct to help and her instinct to protect herself. As the day stretched on, she found herself imagining what would happen if she agreed. She pictured herself arriving at his family's Christmas gathering, pretending to love him, pretending to know stories she had never lived, pretending to belong in a world she had never entered. She pictured the eyes of strangers, his family, judging her, assessing her, expecting her to fit into a narrative built from years of lies and pressure. And she pictured herself smiling through it all, because that's what kindness often looked like. A smile masking discomfort, a nod masking reluctance, a gesture masking exhaustion. But this time the stakes were too high. This wasn't helping someone with a small favor. This wasn't offering support at work. This was constructing a lie that would require emotional labor she had never agreed to give. She began to understand something she had ignored for years. Kindness must have boundaries, or it turns into obligation. Obligation turns into resentment, and resentment turns into self-betrayal. She didn't want to betray herself, not her values, not her instincts, not the quiet voice inside her whispering that something about this situation was not hers to carry. She could empathize with her boss's pain, but empathy didn't require self-sacrifice. She could care about his dilemma without stepping into it. And as she sat there staring at her computer screen, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions, she realized that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about her, the version of herself she had outgrown, the version who always said yes, the version who believed that being good meant giving more than she had to give. Workplace ethics had always been something she took seriously, not because someone taught her to, but because she believed in the importance of fairness, respect, and clear boundaries in professional spaces. She knew that offices functioned smoothly when everyone understood the rules. What was appropriate, what wasn't, and where the lines between personal and professional were drawn. But now, with her boss's request weighing on her like a stone in her chest, she felt those rules bending under the strain of something she never expected to face. She found herself sitting at her desk, wondering how a place she once saw as structured and predictable had suddenly become a landscape filled with ethical shadows. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unsettling in a way that made her rethink everything she believed about the workplace. She knew that power dynamics were not just theoretical. They were real, impactful, and capable of shaping everything from comfort to compliance. Her boss, regardless of his intentions, held authority over her career. He determined her performance reviews, assigned her responsibilities, and influenced her opportunities for growth. Even though he had never misused that power before, she couldn't ignore the reality that his request, personal, emotional, and deeply inappropriate, was made within a structure where saying no didn't feel simple or safe. It wasn't that she feared retaliation. It was the subtle, unspoken fear of disappointing someone who had control over her professional path. That, she realized, was what made the situation ethically complicated. The imbalance of power didn't need to be spoken for it to exist. It simply did. As she contemplated the situation, she thought about the policies she'd read during her orientation, the pages outlining professional conduct, respectful interactions, and the importance of maintaining boundaries. The guidelines were clear. Personal involvement between employees, especially when power imbalances existed, needed to be handled carefully or avoided altogether. But what happened when the involvement wasn't romantic, but still deeply personal? What happened when the request wasn't flirtatious, but still inappropriate? The manuals didn't prepare employees for situations like this, for emotional entanglements disguised as favors, for pleas that blurred roles, for ethical dilemmas coded in desperation. She wished in that moment that her company's handbook had a chapter titled "What to Do When Your Boss Asks You to Pretend to Be His Wife." But of course, nothing could have prepared her for this. She imagined what HR would say if she walked into their office and explained everything. They would listen, she assumed, but how would they interpret the situation? Would they see her boss as a man under emotional stress, making an unwise but harmless request? Or would they see him as someone abusing his position, even unintentionally? And what about her? Would they believe she felt pressured, or would they assume she was overreacting? Ethical dilemmas in the workplace were rarely black and white, and this one was tangled with layers of intent, emotion, and vulnerability. She wasn't even sure how she felt. How could she expect HR to know what to do? The uncertainty made her chest tighten, reminding her that sometimes the hardest part of ethical situations wasn't choosing the right thing. It was figuring out what right even meant. She also worried about how things might look to others if they ever found out. Even if his request was innocent in motive, even if nothing physical or romantic happened, the optics alone could damage her credibility. In an office setting, perceptions shaped reputations just as much as actions did. If colleagues believed she had some kind of personal involvement with her boss, even a fabricated one, it could lead to whispers, assumptions, or even resentment. People might think she received special treatment. They might believe she had advantages others didn't. They might question her professionalism or the legitimacy of her accomplishments. And once reputations were damaged, rebuilding them was almost impossible. That was the cruel reality of workplace politics. Truth mattered less than perception. All of this made her realize that ethics weren't just about following rules. They were about protecting the integrity of the workplace and the people within it. Her boss's request threatened that integrity, even if he didn't mean it to. By asking her to participate in something secretive, personal, and far outside the bounds of professionalism, he had placed her in a position that could compromise her credibility, her comfort, and her career. She didn't want to see him as a villain. He wasn't one. But the ethical implications of what he had asked were undeniable. And as she stared at the stack of work on her desk, pretending to focus while her mind churned with conflicting thoughts, she realized that the decision she made next would not just affect her relationship with her boss. It would shape her understanding of ethics, boundaries, and her own self-worth. As a professional, courage, she had always believed, came in dramatic forms: running into danger, standing up in crowded rooms, fighting against visible injustices. But as she sat alone at her desk, her boss's request echoing in her mind, she began to understand a quieter, far more complicated form of courage: the courage to say no. It wasn't loud or heroic. It didn't come with applause or recognition. Instead, it lived inside moments exactly like this, moments where saying no meant risking disappointment, risking misunderstanding, and risking the loss of someone else's approval. She realized that courage wasn't just about overcoming fear. It was about facing the discomfort of choosing herself, even when someone else needed her. And right now, choosing herself felt harder than anything she had ever done. She felt torn between two worlds: the world where she wanted to protect her boss from embarrassment and emotional turmoil, and the world where she needed to protect herself from becoming entangled in something that didn't belong to her. The conflict was invisible to everyone else in the office, but to her, it felt immense. Saying yes might have seemed easier, smoother, even kinder. It would spare her boss from the awkwardness of facing his family alone. It would protect the fragile image he had built over years of pressure. It would solve his immediate crisis. But saying yes also meant sacrificing her boundaries, her comfort, and potentially her sense of self. And that was the quiet truth she could no longer ignore. A decision made out of fear or guilt was not kindness. It was surrender. She thought about all the times she had said yes in her life simply to avoid conflict. Yes to extra work when she was exhausted. Yes to family obligations when she needed rest. Yes to friends when she wanted space. She had built a pattern of agreement, one small yes at a time, until saying no felt like an act of rebellion rather than self-preservation. But this situation, this request to step inside a lie, to carry someone else's emotional burden while hiding it from the world, was unlike anything she had faced before. If she said yes now, she wasn't just agreeing to a favor. She would be stepping into a role she never auditioned for, a story she never wanted to be part of. And somewhere deep inside her, a voice she had ignored for years whispered that this time, she needed to draw a line. The thought of telling him no scared her more than she wanted to admit. He wasn't just her boss. He was someone she respected, someone who had supported her professionally, someone she didn't want to hurt. She imagined his face falling in disappointment, imagined him feeling betrayed or alone, imagined the weight of that guilt settling on her shoulders. But as she pictured those scenarios, she realized something else. His emotions were his responsibility, not hers. She could be compassionate without taking ownership of his struggles. She could be gentle without compromising herself. Saying no didn't mean she didn't care. It meant she cared enough about both of them not to let a single desperate request create a ripple of consequences they would both regret. She also recognized that saying no required her to trust herself more than she trusted his reaction. For once, she needed to believe that her discomfort mattered, that her instincts meant something, that her boundaries were not up for negotiation simply because someone else was hurting. The courage to say no wasn't about rejecting him, it was about choosing a healthier relationship with herself. And that thought, though quiet, gave her a sense of clarity she hadn't felt since the beginning of the conversation. She realized that fear often tried to disguise itself as responsibility, guilt, or obligation. But underneath all of that was the truth. Fear wanted to silence her. Courage wanted to speak. As she leaned back in her chair, staring at nothing and everything all at once, she felt the weight of the moment pressing gently but firmly against her. The decision she needed to make wouldn't just affect the holiday season. It would shape how she navigated the world moving forward. Saying no would be uncomfortable, awkward, maybe even painful. But saying yes would cost her something far greater. And though she didn't yet know how she would find the words or where she would find the strength, she understood that courage lived not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments like this, moments when choosing herself was the bravest thing she could possibly do. The next morning, she walked into the office with a clarity she hadn't felt in days. Her heart still pounded at the thought of confronting him, but her steps were steady, grounded in a decision she knew she needed to make. When she knocked on his door, he looked up immediately, as if he had been waiting, hoping, bracing for her answer. His expression held a mix of anticipation and fear, an unspoken plea that she could almost feel across the room. She took a deep breath, letting the silence settle before she spoke. And then, gently but firmly, she told him no, not unkindly, not coldly, just honestly. She explained that she understood his situation, respected his vulnerability, and wished him nothing but peace. But she couldn't take on a role that asked her to sacrifice her own comfort, her own values, and her own boundaries. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His shoulders slumped, the exhaustion he had been hiding surfacing all at once, and she wondered if she had just broken him in a way she hadn't meant to. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of anger or resentment, he nodded, slowly, reluctantly, but sincerely. It was as if her refusal had forced him to see the line he had crossed, the pressure he had placed on her, and the weight of his request from a perspective he hadn't considered. She saw something shift in his eyes, not disappointment, but understanding. A realization that sometimes the truth, though difficult, was necessary to rebuild what had been lost long before this conversation. His own sense of self, and perhaps even his integrity. They sat in silence for a long time, the air heavy but not hostile, and in that quiet, she felt something profound. Relief. Relief that she had chosen herself. Relief that she had protected her boundaries. Relief that she had spoken with honesty instead of compliance. She hadn't betrayed him. She had simply refused to betray herself. As she stood to leave, he thanked her, not for saying yes, but for being honest, for offering clarity when he had been blinded by his own desperation. She walked out of his office feeling taller, stronger, and somehow more herself than she had in years. The weight that had clung to her since the moment he made his request finally lifted, replaced by a calm certainty that she had made the right choice. And that Christmas, instead of pretending to be someone she wasn't, she spent the holiday surrounded by people who knew her, loved her, and needed no performances from her at all. She realized something powerful then. Sometimes the most meaningful victories come not from saving someone else, but from saving yourself. And sometimes the greatest gifts are not the ones you give away, but the ones you finally allow yourself to keep.